Right, thanks. Here we go.
Okay then, thanks Susanna, and welcome to our webinar on natural colonisation. So I'll kick off with one of my slides. As we're aware, there's increasing interest in using natural colonisation to complement tree planting, in the hope that it may be cheaper, more effective in terms of tree establishment, tree suitability, structural complexity and biodiversity benefits, and carry fewer risks than tree planting. However, at the moment, there's considerable uncertainty over the spatial scale at which natural colonisation may be an effective approach in terms of the distance to the nearest seed source. Ideally, to find this out, we would set up experiments in a controlled environment in controlled landscapes and wait for 20 years to see what happens. However, we need answers very urgently to help inform policy and practice of actually people using this technique to increase woodland cover. So to overcome this challenge, we managed to find 90 former woodland grant scheme sites which attempted to use natural colonisation around 20 years ago. And these were spread across 4 former land use types: acid grasslands, arable landscapes, heathland and improved grassland in the lowlands and uplands of England. In the bottom right hand figure, you can see the distribution of those sites there and the numbers in each category. And once we found those sites there, rather than actually visit all those sites, we used airborne LiDAR data, which is basically an aircraft flying over, firing down laser points. And when it intercepts the vegetation or the ground surface, you can actually count, you can create tree models and count the height of individual trees and how many there are at different distances from our source woodlands. So that shows you the bottom left figures. That's a cross section of a LiDAR image to show the red colour is the canopy height and the blue is lower ground cover. There's a cross section, and you can see the corresponding aerial image of a naturally colonised site in the photograph in the centre. So we've used that to actually count our trees on these sites. So from that, we've revealed from those sites that natural colonisation is a highly variable process. It occurs at a spatial scale of around 100 metres after around 20 years. That success criteria of 100 metres is based upon the sites having 100 stems per hectare, which is in accordance with the existing England Woodland Creation Offer grant scheme. So that shows the spatial scale, and the top right hand figure shows those lines there from the seed source on the left hand side and how that declines with distance to the seed source. But you can see that it's a highly variable process. Success in those sites so far, we think, is driven primarily by proximity, density and variability of seed source, to a degree by former land use, and I think most importantly from examination of some of those sites is herbivore pressure. So that's a useful site at a very large scale. However, this study provides no details of the actual trees that are colonising these sites and whether the LiDAR approach actually measures those trees. So that's my slide, Susanna. So it's me again then, so I can extend this a bit more now. So let me see a minute. Sorry, just lost my place a minute. Okay, so to take this sort of LiDAR study a bit further, we conducted some field surveys on 10 of those sites that were around 10 to 20 years old, and they were all adjacent to mature woodland. That, as you can see in the map in the centre. Within those sites, we measured tree species, tree size and density of trees along a transect from a mature woodland into the area of natural colonisation. These extended up to 120 metres from the nearest seed source. We also measured the tree communities within the source mature woodlands and the communities within the naturally colonised sites to see how they compare and which trees are colonising those new young sites and which ones are not managing to get out at those sites. The key finding from that, which was very encouraging, is it confirms the results from our LiDAR study. So it said that tree density declines with distance, and it got to around 100 stems per hectare at about 150 metres, so slightly further out, but the lower confidence interval limit in the top figure crosses the line of 100 stems per hectare at around 80 metres. So it's quite realistic to think around 100 metres over 20 years is a reasonable spatial scale for this to work on. In terms of the tree communities, they were often quite different within the naturalised areas from the mature existing woodlands. So only a proportion of the communities were getting out. And you can see those indications in the bottom right figure. The circle represents the existing mature woodland and the triangle is the corresponding naturally colonised woodlands. So you can see that the distances, the lines between those circles and triangles are the same colours, shows you how different the communities are. And then how some of those triangles are starting to group together in terms of the type of woodland you're creating. And we found that from those 10 sites, you were getting some sites that were developing into more oak dominated sites, some sites that were getting very much swamped by willows, so you're getting very much single species of willows colonising some of these sites, and some that were very much dominated by thorns and ash species as well. But it did confirm that there's a large variation in tree communities within and between these sites, driven by a range of factors, including seed sources, herbivore pressure, land use, and ground preparation. Our next bit of work for this is to look at a longer chrono sequence of sites spanning 5 to 60 years old. And then we're trying to look at if those initial communities are just an early part of succession and whether that will change through time. And then we'll also be looking at the biodiversity impacts of a longer sequence of sites as well. So that's my second slide finished. So thanks all for listening.
Hi everyone, my name is Laura Brown-Holtz. I'm based at University of Stirling, and like Susanna and a few others on this call, I'm working on the PlaNat project. So my work is focusing on the ecological aspect of the project, where our overall aims are investigating the socio-economic outcomes of tree expansion, looking at a range of different methods of creating woodlands, from planting to natural colonisation. So we have 28 sites that we've been focusing across England, and 9 of those are natural colonisation sites, indicated on the map in the bottom right corner. And all of our sites are former arable or improved grassland areas, with a range of sizes from slightly just under 2 to a bit over 16 hectares. Most of our sites are directly adjacent to mature woodland, but we have a little variation that our furthest site is 260 metres from any established woodland. And they're all relatively young sites, so between 14 to 27 years since natural colonisation started. And in those sites, we've found a bit of variation, similar to mentioned by Kevin in the sites that they studied. So in terms of the sort of big trees, we found between 3 and 12 tree species, and the most common ones across the sites were willow, hawthorn, oak, and birch species. All of them sort of met the requirements for over 100 stems per hectare. And there was a bit of variation between the number of seedlings and saplings found at the sites. Most of our sites are sort of display quite a mosaic still of open areas, some scrubby, thorny areas, and then some sort of closed canopy woodland. There's a bit of variation of that we're still investigating. One of the sort of findings that is just an observation at the moment is that the willow dominated sites tended to be those with the sort of closed canopy occurring. So yeah, still investigating the results of our field work over the summer. But in terms of the factors enabling colonisation, it would probably be, the proximity to seed sources. We found relatively low herbivory of seedlings, despite a lot of the sites not having much deer management. And yeah, again, the lack of time since establishing, all under 30 years, probably leading to the patchiness in some areas of not being colonised. And then some site characteristics probably leading to also to the variation within sites and possibly between sites. But yeah, the analyses are ongoing. But that's sort of a broad overview of the work that we've done so far in PlaNat.
Hello everyone, this is me. I'm Richard Porton from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology in Wallingford, and I'm involved with the Monkswood Wilderness Experiment in Cambridgeshire. And this is one of the oldest monitored natural colonisation sites. It dates back to the 1960s, so long before I was born. We're getting on for 65 years now for this. And it was a planned experiment on former arable and grassland fields. So they were deliberately taken out of any kind of management to see what happens, basically, and without any intervention. So we have a chronosequence of sites, one from the 1960s, one from the 1980s, sorry, and then another one from the 1990s. So this site represents ideal conditions for natural colonisation because the fields are right next to the Monkswood Ancient Woodland, which is 160 hectares of ancient woodland. And this has lots of seed sources and seed dispersers right next door. And it's typical rich Cambridgeshire clay soil, lowland area. So it's pretty much ideal conditions for trees to establish. And this is really an exercise in woodland expansion onto neighbouring fields, really. So rather than woodland creation in a distant area, this is the woodland expanding outwards for distances of up to 170 metres from the seed source. And we monitored this with LiDAR, also structure from motion, so just a standard small drone, you can do this now, and also field surveys. And we found that the colonisation was very successful. Within 10 years, we had, as already been mentioned, a mosaic of hawthorn and bramble and grassland. And this created a sort of shrubby grassland mosaic, which was actually fantastic early successional habitat for songbirds and wildflowers. Species like nightingale, willow warbler and turtle dove, they really love this kind of intermediate stage. And the shrubs are seems to be deposited mostly from berry seeds in bird droppings, so especially winter thrushes. So fieldfares, redwings, blackbirds, songthrushes, they're foraging on these open grassy fields and they're seeding the shrubby mosaic. But within this thorny mosaic, there are lots of tree seedlings which come in right from the beginning, but they hide away for quite a long time among the thorns, and especially oak trees, which have been planted by the jays coming from the nearby woodland. Probably also grey squirrels too. We don't know how many of the grey squirrel planted ones survive, but they certainly plant quite a lot. And there's also some windblown ash and field maple coming in too, but oak is the one which has the best spread just because of the seed dispersers are transporting it much further distances. So these shrub thickets act as a nursery for the tree saplings, and despite there being lots of muntjac on site and roe deer and also Chinese water deer, they seem to be quite lazy and they don't want to go poking around in the thickets. So these thorny thickets act as nursery to enable enough tree saplings to get established. And this is why we called it the wilderness experiment. Well, it wasn't me, but it's the original experiment is a bit of an in-joke with them in that it was just impenetrable. For about 10 years, you can't really get into these thickets to even find the trees, let alone count them. So they called it the wilderness. And after about 25 years on the bottom photo, the trees start to overtop the shrub thicket. So these trees break through the shrub canopy and actually start forming a tree canopy. And this is very naturalistic way of kind of woodland establishment because you've got a tree canopy forming over a ready-made shrubby understory. So the thicket becomes the woodland understory as the tree canopy breaks through. And also where the deer have been grazing or where there's some wet patches, we retain some flowery open glades. And after about 40 to 50 years, we got naturalistic oak ash woodland, which is the top photo. About 400 trees per hectare, which is very close to what we see in the ancient woodland. So the tree density is very similar to what we see in the adjacent ancient woodland. And it's at this stage, it's total canopy cover we got over 4 hectares, which is our maximum plot size. So the top photo shows it after about 60 years, which is a couple of years ago. We're getting on for 65 years now. So this looks to be a very successful way of expanding this woodland, at least, onto neighbouring fields. And this creates new woodland habitat, but also, and we think this is quite important, it also builds resilience into the existing ancient woodland next door because it buffers it from outside effects. It creates a fringing buffer from agricultural spray drifting in, also from heat waves and climate change, where you get very desiccating winds blowing in from the south. This has created a very dense buffer, really, which protects the ancient woodland. And we had zero management on these fields. We've done absolutely nothing. There has been no fencing, no deer control, no thinning. It's all natural processes. And it's still evolving too. Over time, we expect that it's going to mature and we'll start to get gaps in the canopy as some of the trees start dying and falling over. There's lots of self-thinning going on in the early stages. And we expect now some of the trees are going to start dying as well, some of the more mature ones. And that will add to the habitat diversity. And also new species are still arriving too, even after 50, 60 years, we're still getting new species coming in from the woodland. So things like hazel were very late to arrive. We're still waiting for wild service, which hasn't appeared yet. So this is an ongoing process, and we're thinking of it in terms of this is future ancient woodland. This plot of woodland here is almost, you couldn't tell the difference really from the air that this is not ancient woodland. And this is what it's going to be in, by the time it gets to 100 years old, it's going to be future ancient woodland. And that's it.
Well, hi everyone. So I'm Vanessa Burton. I work for the Woodland Trust, and I'm going to talk through our, I think it's our last lowland example. And this one's less about kind of current ecological outcomes at the moment, and I guess more about kind of integrating monitoring and research into management, and also trying to address some current knowledge gaps. So this is a woodland creation site that's adjacent to our Pepperwood site, which is an ancient woodland near Birmingham. It's currently just called Pepperwood Extension. I think it's going through kind of renaming in consultation with local stakeholders at the moment. And I'm pretty sure they're going to go with Fairfield Forest. I was pretty sad that they didn't run with Saltwood. That would have been great. But anyway, this is it's ex-mixed agricultural fields. Most recently kind of grazed by sheep, which are right next to Pepperwood, which you can see at the kind of bottom left figure there. And so the total area of the creation site as a whole is 51 hectares, and it's got a really varied design. So there's a bit of kind of planned planting, which is fenced, and that's kind of under a carbon agreement. But most of the rest of the site is unfenced and relying on a whole load of mixed methods, so natural colonisation and a bit of direct seeding as well. And we're focusing this work on a subcompartment which is relying completely on natural colonisation from the adjacent woodland. And we thought it was a really great opportunity to test for the effects of ground preparation on natural colonisation success, mainly, I guess, to deal with kind of expected high nutrient levels because of the agricultural setting. And so what we've done is set up these kind of four plots with different methods. So we've got kind of mob grazed by sheep. We've got a control where we're just leaving it, chain harrow kind of scarification, and then turf strip where the whole kind of top layer has been taken off. And we're doing a kind of variety of monitoring on this. So we've done some soil sampling in collaboration with Forest Research. That's part of a kind of wider study that's trying to look at the kind of carbon balance of different ground preparation methods. And then we're going to be monitoring it in fixed quadrats in terms of the vegetation development. So yeah, as I say, no kind of findings at the moment, but hopefully it's going to give us a better idea of success in this kind of lowland agricultural setting, and whether ground preparation is worth it, whether that kind of equation of doing ground prep, seeing what effect that has on natural colonisation versus any kind of change in carbon balance that you get with those methods. I think that's me.
Okay. So first of all, introduction to me. So my name's Dr. Thomas Murphy. So I'm an environmental scientist focusing on woodland restoration of Atlantic oak wood in particular at the University of Plymouth. So what I'm going to do is just going to give a brief case study, which sort of encapsulates some of the wider work that we've been doing in the southwest, but also up that Atlantic oak woodland sort of extent. So this is a case study from down on the western edge of Dartmoor. It's a beautiful a valley called Merivale. So it's based on the fringes of Sanford Spiny SSSI, and this is just an example which I think is feeds into some of the findings that Kevin showed you earlier around differences in species having those different dispersal distances and also mechanisms. So this is an area very much of unplanned regeneration, which most of it is around the country and more widely. In terms of when we started to see this regeneration at the edge of this Atlantic oak woodland, this happened around 10 years ago, so 10 to 15 years ago, and we noticed, interestingly, the dispersal distance, particularly of the oak, was focused around the first 10 meters away from the canopy fringe. So a very short dispersal distance, with rowan, hawthorn and holly having much greater dispersal ranges. So you're seeing lots of variation within this area of regen. So I should say it's an area of upland pasture, so acidic soils, highly leached organic surface soils. So it gets pretty wet, but also pretty dry in summer because these are well-drained soils. In terms of factors then that and starting to enable this colonisation, as you'll see in the picture on the bottom right, we found granite clitter seems to be a really beneficial ally, if you like, of oak in particular in these heavily grazed environments where wind exposure is a significant factor. Very short distance from of dispersal, so this landscape is a heavily grazed landscape, very low tree cover, as many of our uplands do have, very low woodland extent. And we also found that bracken is pairing, working in combination with those boulders to be able to protect these early saplings from browsing and herbivory. In terms of factors hindering, one of the things we're noticing is as you can see, the picture in the top of heavily grazed seedling or sapling now, which is remains about 20 inches from the ground, is natural colonisation, but is it really creating viable woodland? So we've got pressure from grassland swards in those generally shallow soils, but particularly browsing pressure is an issue. So this is work which we're looking to build on in terms of the expansion and establishment of this really important woodland type. So yeah, that's a very brief case study. I look forward to discussing further.
Thank you, Tom. My name is Richard Thompson. I am Forestry and Land Scotland's native woodland ecologist, and in a former life I worked for Forest Research. One of the things I did there was to study natural colonisation, principally of birch and pine woods in the Scottish Highlands. This is one of several sites that I looked at that had woodland grant schemes for natural colonisation, analogous to Kevin's work. Actually, we're 20 odd years on here, and noticed some similar things and some quite contrasting things as well. So this site is in Banffshire, up in the northeast of Scotland. Anybody who's a fan of malt whiskey, they'll know the Tumnavulin whiskey. This was right by the distillery. And you can maybe make out in the photograph a poorly scanned 35mm slide in the bottom left-hand corner, a sheen of green over the top of the heather. And that was the birch regeneration beginning to get established on this area of open heath. The regeneration event began in the mid-80s as a result of a very large and hot fire over this upland heathland site. Podzolic soil, H12 NVC community, and W17 upland birchwood down below it, with prevailing winds up onto the open hill. So it's these sort of sites that we saw the most success with in terms of site type: free draining acidic soils and fairly dry soils as a result, relatively dry soils in that part of the world. By contrast, the sites that had much less success were those that were nutrient poor, but also very wet sites. The mires, for example, both birch and pine would struggle significantly on those. The most notable thing about this site was the extent of the colonisation when we measured it in the early 2000s, and we were still seeing some reasonable, I noticed a comment from Jeanette there about muir burning, I'll come on to that now. We were still seeing some reasonable densities of seedlings at 600 meters, which was far in excess of what we were normally seeing. Overall, 60% of seedlings were found, 90% of seedlings were found within 60 meters of the canopy edge. So that was substantially further distance of colonisation. As you say, Jeanette, you can see muir burning in the 2021 photograph. The update, for me, is very much a desk exercise, and I will go and have a look at this site. This has renewed my interest in the site, preparing for this, and I'm fascinated to know, has the muir burning reduced the amount of regeneration, or was the scheme, the woodland grant scheme, taken to the most successful areas and then muir burning allowed beyond that? Be interesting to see. So you may just be able to make out the areas of regeneration in the 2021 aerial photograph, and you can see there round about 100-meter dispersal distance being a reliable distance there. And as I say, in other places, we would have said 100 meters, you would be seeing a tail off of that regeneration in most other sites. So fire, yes, I'm not advocating the use of fire as a conservation tool by any means. I think an awful lot of biodiversity has been removed from the uplands of the UK as a result of fire, and a dwarf birch reduced to wet sites, juniper reduced to the side of streams and rock outcrops and crags due to fire. So I'm not advocating it, but that is one of the mechanisms where large-scale regeneration events do happen in the uplands. Another one is dramatic, sudden reduction in large herbivores. So reinstatement of large numbers of herbivores is going to be a factor hindering subsequent colonisation, and that can happen certainly if a deer fence was required to establish the colonisation in the first place. I could ramble on for hours, but I think I will pass on to George. Thank you.
Okay, yes, so I'm George Porton from the University of Leeds, and the site I'm talking to you about today is Wild Ingleborough, which is based in the Yorkshire Dales. It's a site that's in the uplands and varies from about 300 to 650 meters elevation. And it's got a mixture of sort of soils, and it's got a lot of limestone pavement in the area, and also has areas of peatland. So the site's about 1,100 hectares, and it's historically been managed by both Natural England and Yorkshire Wildlife Trust. And in the past, the entire area used to be grazed by sheep, and over time, different fields have had sheep removed in different years. Some of these have been replaced by extensive cattle grazing, and some of these areas have been left ungrazed. It's a relatively sort of there's not much woodland remaining in the area, and some of the areas in our study are over sort of 2 kilometers from the nearest woodland. And with the start of the Wild Ingler project in the last few years, we've started surveying with sort of ground surveys this natural colonisation. And the results that we've got so far clearly show, as we were expecting, that sheep is one of the main limiting factors for natural colonisation at the site. And potentially more interestingly, there was a similar density of natural colonisation on ungrazed sites and cattle grazed sites. With increasing number of years since sheep were removed from a site, you also then got a higher density of trees. And again, as you'd expected, you got a higher density of trees that in areas closer to woodland. And similar to what other people have been discussing, the models that we've created predict about a stem density of 1,000 after 30 years since sheep were removed at a distance of around 90 meters from woodland. Although it should be noted, this is still probably far from a recognizable woodland, and it has a lot of sort of scrub in those areas probably. We also found on limestone soil there was considerably more natural colonisation than you'd find on the other areas, the other soil areas in the study, such as the peatlands that we have. And I think this is partly due to similar reasoning that Tom was discussing in with the rockier areas, providing both a colonisation niche for the trees and also protecting it from the grazing and the elements of it. So yeah, the main factors in enabling natural colonisation at the site was the removal of sheep grazing, and the main limiting factors are the lack of seed sources in the area. So yeah, I think that's me.
Thanks, George. So I'm Dominic Spracklin from also at the University of Leeds, talking about a second study site that's in Cumbria. It's also an upland landscape up to about 500 meters above sea level. It's a Forest England site that used to be predominantly a conifer plantation that's now being restored to native woodland through natural regeneration and natural colonisation. And what we can see here is that there's been very rapid and effective sapling regeneration here. So we have on average about 3,000 saplings per hectare across the site, and that regeneration starts quite quickly. There's quite a diverse range of native tree species at the site, with 13 different native tree species that we see, although that is dominated by birch, rowan and willow that you can see at the bottom right here. We do see a very clear sign that we see much greater regeneration in areas that were plantation and clearfelled compared to areas that were outside of the plantation site. And we think that's mainly due to the soil disturbance that occurred during the clearfell process, and that signal of that disturbed soil allowing that seed source into the soil, and that really kickstarts a very fast regeneration process. So outside of the areas of plantation that were moorland, we don't see as rapid natural colonisation in those areas. The other two things that we see, as other case studies have seen, higher regeneration close to seed source, and we also see a suppression when there's too high deer or sheep numbers in the site. And I'll hand over to the next speaker.
Thanks, Dominic. That led on nicely to Kangom Connect, which is what I'm going to talk about. So I'm Pip, the project scientist for Kangom Connect, which is a partnership between RSPB, Forestry and Land Scotland, Nature Scot and Wildland Limited. So this partnership has a 200-year vision to restore natural processes and ecosystems across 60,000 hectares in the Kangoms. So pretty massive area, pretty massive altitudinal range. So I can't really summarise the habitat in a single sentence, but in terms of woodlands, the partnership contains fragments of native Caledonian pine woods and large areas of native Scots pine plantations, as well as small areas of upland birch woods and a few tiny remnants of montane woodland. And obviously, alongside this, we have massive areas of open heath that would have once harboured trees to varying extents. So in terms of seed source, for Scots pine, there's really extensive seed sources in the lower areas, but very, very little in the way of broadleaf seed sources. And some species like aspen are completely lacking. Higher up the hill, there's massive areas that are hundreds or even thousands of meters from the nearest seed sources, even for pine. And expanding the area of native woodland is one of Kangom's Connect's key targets for all the partners. And they're all trying to achieve this mainly through natural regeneration and colonisation, combined with just small amount of targeted planting. So in this area, the crucial factor hindering natural colonisation in recent decades has been the really high deer numbers. So over the past 30 years or so, the partners have each been massively increasing their deer culling effort to reduce those deer numbers. Other factors, as other people have been speaking about, are of course the lack of seed source. So as I've mentioned, for broadleaves, this is a real problem, hence that targeted planting for some species and in some areas. And in some areas, as others have also said, the lack of regen niches is a problem, particularly where heather has become very dominant and thick rank layers of heather are preventing seeds from germinating and getting away. So we have also across Kangom's Connect been using some targeted vegetation management to try and get around this problem. And recently we've brought together the monitoring data from each of the 4 partners, which has included tree transect surveys and plot-based regeneration surveys. And we've used this data combined to show that since the early 2000s, natural regeneration and colonisation have been progressing really well, even in the presence of deer. And we've shown that each year, about 164 hectares of newly colonising woodland area have been establishing. So this is using that 100 stems per hectare definition. And in this graph here from the nature-scopped part of the land, you can see the recent increase in newly regenerating or colonising woodland. And from this, you can see that the increase in deer culling coincides with a really sharp increase in newly establishing woodland. Unfortunately, one of the less good sides of the story is that we have shown that throughout the partnership area, unsurprisingly, the vast majority of this regen is pine. We're hopeful, though, that deer numbers are now low enough in most areas to allow even those most palatable broadleaf species to get away. So we'll be able to see with the next round of regen surveys whether this plus the targeted planting that we're doing and the field layer management that we're doing are actually enough to enable those broadleaves to start colonising again as well. Thanks. I'll hand back to Susanna.
So fantastic. Thank you so much to all our speakers. It's really brilliant to have so many perspectives from different contexts across the UK. Yeah, we've had loads of interesting comments in the chat as we've been going on. So I think I'll start by summing up a little bit about the density of seedlings that you get through natural colonisation and the big range that we've seen across the sites that our speakers have shown us. So it seems like generally there's a sort of 100 stems per hectare density that appears in a lot of lowland sites that have quite successful colonisation after 15 to 20 years, but then that's really variable. And yeah, Dominic showed us the site in Hard Knot where it was it 3,000? That's very high. And then obviously in Dartmoor as well, we had oaks not moving more than 10 metres away from the existing woodland edge. So it'd be really nice just to hear a bit more from our speakers on what might determine seed density. So we'll start with Kevin as he did the wide scale study on that. And perhaps you could say a bit about your differences between upland and lowland sites in your study, Kevin.
Oh gosh, this has put me on the spot now. So I think in terms of trees per hectare, when we were measuring it with the LiDAR data, it was trees generally over 2 meters. So it's trees that are a bit larger. So I think, if you're measuring, very small saplings and seedlings, the density would be far higher. So I think, we've underestimated it in some ways because you're missing out that seedling and sapling layer. So I think that's one thing to say. But I think in terms of some of the numbers, I think that is that proximity to seed sources. So sometimes you'll get them very high, thousands when you're quite close to some of these seed sources, and it's supposed to certain species. So on some ash sites, you're getting very, very high density of ash near some ash dominated woodlands, but then a lot of those are suffering mortality as well. So I think a lot of it is what tree species you have and how they're colonising, really. And also we said things like we found a lot of high density of blackthorn and hawthorn. So when you've got birds moving out from seeds, it might be perching on nearby posts and branches and even some planted woodland, you get a high density or a pulsar density in some of those areas. So I think a lot of it is which tree species you're talking about in terms of density and where that is in relation to the seed sources. So if that covers it a bit, that's why I think with some like with Thomas's work on with oak, that's very much driven by birds might be dispersing it or gravity, and it's might be looking at larger established trees. So is that enough to kick off the conversation?
Yeah, that's great, thank you. So I'm going to hand over to Laura because she spent summer crawling through thorny scrub counting seedlings, and I think she has some comments on what sorts of species appear at high density.
Yeah, similar to Kevin, we found that quite often when you're looking at seedlings, we found very high density of ash and blackthorn in particular, hawthorn as well. But those were notably, especially for ash and blackthorn, not very common in the sort of larger tree database. So for blackthorn, it's probably just, well, they might not ever meet the requirements of being counted as a large tree, also being outcompeted eventually by other trees coming through and blocking out the light. But for ash in particular, we found quite high occurrence of dieback, so they were often present in seedling and sapling stages, but much less so in the mature tree. And yeah, definitely a lot of variation between and even within the sites of species composition in our sampling plots. Yeah, not sure what else to say about that.
Brilliant, thank you. And then I wonder, Richard Broughton, do you have information from Monk's Wood on the sorts of species that appear as seedlings and then how those densities change through time? Because that would be really interesting to know.
Yeah, so every tree colonising the site has been tagged and marked for about the past 30 years when they get to a minimum density, a minimum size. It's the widest dispersal is with oak, just because of the seed dispersers transporting the acorns, but ash and field maple are the wind dispersal really helps. So where you get a neighbouring ash, there will be a halo of young ash around it. And then the further you get away from the seed source, the more likely they are to peter out. But you still get a good density of oaks for a much further period just because of the different dispersal. I mean, we don't have pine or birch there, well, not much birch. So it's difficult to compare. So the limited seed sources that you have also determine what sort of dispersal you're going to get just by the different modes of dispersal. So I can imagine that somewhere with lots of birch, like on a heathland, will get them going, for hundreds of meters on the wind, whereas oaks aren't going to get very far if you don't have any jays.
Thank you. And does anyone have anything to add to that from an upland context where the processes might be a bit different? Yeah, Richard.
Thanks, Thea. I'm just thinking of a site not too far from the House of Brewer, for those who know it, by the A9 in Highland, Perthshire. And that's a moorland area about 2 miles away from ash seed source. And yet there's ash seedlings scattered widely over the hill there. And I think that's because there are some base-rich flushes, but there's very, very low nitrogen availability. And I think that sward stays open and has very, very low competition and allows for very occasional successful germination of widely dispersed ash seedlings, ash seed, I should say, that occurs on a very irregular sort of stochastic basis.
Thank you. Yeah, Thomas.
Yeah, it's just building on that point, and I suppose the work that George has been doing in terms of the soil being a really important factor in terms of that acidity. That's an interesting determinant of you know, nutrient availability, competition. So I think in the uplands where you've potentially got quite contrast in those nutrient loads, that's an important factor in terms of regeneration. That's obviously what George has found in his study, and I suppose I want to agree with Rich in terms of thinking about those vectors of establishment being different in different landscapes. And whilst the jays in the lowlands might be present with a good canopy cover and a wooded landscape, certainly in our upland environments where the fragments of woodland can be small, as Wistman's Wood is a good example, then those vectors of establishment are missing, those key vectors, and that's so it's really about that horses for courses really in terms of natural colonisation. But I think an interesting angle for future would be developing the soils work to understand those better.
Thank you. And actually that's fantastic, because I wanted to lead on to talking a bit more about soils. So Pip, you made some interesting comments when we were preparing for the webinar about your thoughts on mycorrhizae. Would you like to say a bit about that and anything else on soils that you've come across?
I think my thoughts were mostly that that's one of the big unknowns for us in Kangom Connect, the role that plays in our landscape, hindering colonisation in areas that have been long deforested and may have lost that mycorrhizal community. So that's definitely an area that we really want and need to research a bit more into.
Yeah, and Vanessa, I think you also had some interesting comments around setting up your experiment, which is also looking at soils and the differences that in carbon with ground prep. Yeah, and it'd be really good to hear about the sort of challenges of setting up that kind of experiment, because obviously it's a huge unknown and it'd be great to get more data on.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, I guess in general it was just quite challenging to set up, to make sure that we were setting up an experiment that could be like managed relatively simply and also be kind of designed well enough for us to get like decent results out of it. So I guess we didn't design it in a kind of ideal way from a scientific point of view, because it just would have been too faffy for management. So yeah, what we've done is kind of do randomized soil samples across the plots that we have, to try and get a better idea of how that varies across the site, and if that has any bearing on it. And yeah, I guess it's only one site, so but hopefully we'll get some insights into that. And yeah, just to add a little bit to the mycorrhizal stuff, I think there were lots of nods when Pip was saying that that's a big unknown, and I think there's starting to be a lot of like commercial treatments and stuff that are kind of popping up, and I think generally I think we're quite wary of those, but really interested, I guess, because it's kind of applying really simple or a smaller selection of kind of fungal species to really kind of complex specific communities that vary a lot by context. So I think, yeah, I noticed in the chat someone was asking about kind of using just wood chip and stuff like that, and so there's kind of these range of kind of like adjacency treatments that you could call them, that kind of maybe using some wood from adjacent woodland or some soil from adjacent woodland, or you get kind of like compost teas and stuff like that. Just yeah, really interested in kind of trying to find out more about things like that, but yeah, huge knowledge gap at the moment.
Brilliant, thank you. So we've not got too much longer left, but I'm really keen to get through some of the interesting questions in the chat. So something that's come up is, could speakers comment on the ecological and environmental benefits of using natural colonisation to create woodland, and then linking to that, currently the grant schemes just require monitoring in terms of do you have the sufficient stem density after a certain period of time or not? And should there be other ways of measuring the success? Yeah, Thomas.
Yeah, just I suppose one of the obvious ones in terms of the ecological benefits is that diversity. So in terms of, you know, Kevin's obviously picked that up in his work in terms of the variation in species in terms of those dispersal distances, but also having that lower density of stems is actually beneficial if we're thinking about the span of these sites, you know, colonizing over you know, a large time span. That's creating structural diversity in the future of that woodland. So that is only a good thing for the ecological complexity of that site. So I suppose that's the obvious one. But I'm sure there's plenty more.
Yeah, Richard.
Thompson or Broughton?
I wasn't sure which Richard.
Sorry, there are two of you. Thompson, let's go.
I think
first.
Kevin. All right, I thought Kevin.
I'm
was
first.
Next, sorry. Yeah, I'll be very brief, Kevin. Yeah, I was just going to say that if you concentrate on natural colonisation, this is taking a leaf out of Trees for Life's book. They're looking at core ancient woodland areas and building from those at the moment, and that's what you're naturally doing. If you're using natural colonisation, you're focusing on the remnant woodlands and building from those, allowing those to expand. Whereas if you're looking at planting, you're not always doing that. You're potentially creating a woodland away from the woodland habitat network. So for me, that's the biggest strength strategically, tactically. You're building on the network. Right, I'll shut up and let Kevin speak.
Okay, cheers, Richard. Yeah, so there's a lot of talk about sort of the biodiversity benefits and nature recovery of natural colonisation, but there's often quite little evidence to support it. So what we're doing now on the sites we're looking at now, so we're looking at about 40 sites spanning between 5 and 60 years old, including Richard's site at Monkswood as well. And then we're doing transects and surveys across those sites from mature woodland into colonised area and looking at things like vascular plants, insect communities. So we're putting out malaise traps and doing meta barcoding to look at the communities and what's in those systems. We're working with RSPB, looking at bird surveys on those sites. So we're trying to actually capture what is that biodiversity value of those sites and how does that compare to the source woodlands. And as Richard says, it may be an extension of some of the woodland biodiversity, but it could also be quite novel ecosystems in terms of it's quite a rare ecotone habitat that we're talking about. So it's this structurally complex, early successional dynamic habitat. So it could have a whole group of species or a whole community which don't see very much of. So I think we can try and capture that and unpick those values and how that changes through time. So it could be linked to some young sites, and as they get older, it may then become more like the mature woodland, which is what Richard was talking about then. So that it represents that. So it's this successional phase. So I think we'll have some data on that end of this project, hopefully early next year.
Brilliant, thank you. Pip.
Yeah, so really following on from exactly what you've been saying, Kevin, in Kangom Connect, we've been trying to get a handle of that, what biodiversity should we be seeing in these naturally colonising woodlands. And so we've got a package of comparative work in southwest Norway in an area that's kind of climatically and geologically very similar to the Kangoms, but which has had the browsing pressure removed about 100 years ago. So we're doing species monitoring in both the Kangoms and that area in southwest Norway to try and get a bit of a handle on, yeah, sort of how far away from the more natural state are we, since we don't have that historic data here from our study site to compare with.
Great, thank you, and Thomas.
Yeah, it's just a quick point to, I suppose, caveat that that structural complexity is very dependent on there being a seed source for lots of different trees. So natural colonisation can often turn into a monoculture so which is obviously not very diverse. So I think Kevin makes an important point that we need to evidence gather for context for that.
That's fantastic, thank you. I'm conscious it's gone 2 o'clock. We've got loads of interesting questions unanswered in the chat as yet. We could go on all afternoon. I think I'm going to squeeze one in selfishly because I've also been wondering it, which is, has anyone looked at nitrogen pollution and whether that might be a factor that affects variation in natural colonisation? And I was also, I mean, so, okay, I was also thinking that I think that acidifies soils, and it was quite interesting that in your limestone areas, George, you had better colonisation, which you attributed to rocks covering up seedlings from sheep.
Yeah, well, I think that they're probably then considerably less acidic than the sort of areas of peatland that we've got in comparison. I think one of the main things is the limestone grasslands as well. I feel like the species composition of the ground flora is also, you know, it provides more regeneration niches than you get on the more sort of blanket bog areas where you probably don't really want trees anyway. But some of the less limestoney areas, yeah.
Does anyone else have any more comments? Yeah, Richard.
Yeah, I think it's about lack of nitrogen availability that promotes good natural colonisation, whether it's free draining limestone soils or free draining acidic soils. I think increases in nitrogen are probably going to be detrimental. I would have thought they're going to increase vegetative competition and make it harder. That would be my assumption.
Great, thank you. Any last comments from any of the speakers? Otherwise, I'll wrap up. No, great. Well, we've overrun a little bit, but it was too interesting to cut off on time. So thank you so much to all our speakers. It's been really interesting, and we could have quite happily gone on all afternoon, I think. We'll make this webinar available on our website in the next days, and someone asked in the chat if the speakers' slides could be shared, and yeah, we'll just discuss that, but I'm sure something will be able to be shared with you because there's been a lot of information shared in quite a short space of time. And as a project, we're looking at both synthesizing existing information and bringing in our new findings as they come out. So please keep an eye on our outputs. They'll be both academic and non-academic, and we hope they'll be of use to you all. Thanks ever so much for attending. And yes, Kevin will share the links to scientific papers that are of interest to this. Thanks very much, everyone. Okay, bye.
Thank you.
Cheers.